This podcast contains content that may be triggering, so please practice self-care, knowing that you can stop, pause, and regulate at any point. In our description, you'll find a free resource to help you do just that, to ground throughout your listening experience. I want to introduce you all to Amita Swadhin, the founder and co-director of Mirror Memoirs, and a lifelong organizer, educator, storyteller, and strategist, working to end interpersonal and institutional violence against young people. Amita is also a good friend and collaborator who I met many years ago in Los Angeles. And so I want to welcome Amita. So glad that you're here. Thank you for being on Be the Bloom.
Thank you so much for having me, Ebony. It's always fun to talk to you, and I'm also curious what it will feel like with people tuning in the future and trying to talk to. I'm so used to talking to you just as a friend and being unfiltered. So I'm trying to also think about like there's other people listening now, which is not always the case when we talk.
That's very true. But you know what? Let's see what happens. I don't know.
I'm game.
All right. So I'm going to invite you to start us off by telling us about your story, and how that walked you to the work that you do.
Okay. Well, I am a survivor of childhood sexual violence, specifically incestuous rape in my home from the ages of 4 until 12 by my father. And I know that can be a mouthful and also a lot for people to sit with and hear. I want people who are tuning in who maybe don't know me or know my work to know, like, at this point in my life, I always have to do the math. How old am I this year? I'm about 32 years into my healing, self-directed healing, where I felt autonomous and some agency around how I was navigating the journey of survivorship. So I'm able to say all of the things that I will share today from a place that's much more as a practitioner and movement organizer and um, healing community worker, storyteller, because I am so far in my journey. And I always want to let other survivors who might be in a different place in their journey know that, I had to do lots of years of just acute tending to myself to be able to talk about my story the way I can talk about it today.
Mm.
So that's my disclaimer about how I discuss my story. Um, how did I get to this work and like making this essentially like one of the larger components of my life's work is a long story. I will try to tell the shortest version of it, but my rapist was my father. My mother was in a pretty textbook domestic violence marriage with my father. He also is a survivor of child sexual abuse. So is my mother. So is her mother. And I'm pretty sure we could draw a long lineage back due to things like the caste system and Brahminical patriarchy. My parents are both immigrants from India. I come from upper caste lineage on all three sides. My mom's parents are from different ethnicities, which is why I say three sides, because she's ethnically mixed. And then my dad is from a completely different ethnicity, all from the South Asian subcontinent, all from Hindu upper caste families. And so, the violence of the caste system is documented, at least like codified, at least about 2,200 years old. And within that codification, there's this document called the Manu Smriti, or the Code of Manu, that says when a girl child is born, she's the property of her father, who can arrange her marriage to anyone of his choice, and then she becomes the property of her husband. And should she outlive her husband but have a son, she then becomes the ward of her own son,
Mm.
right? And so I really try to think and have had the time and capacity to try to make sense of my story inside of a context
Mhm.
because this violence doesn't happen out of nowhere, right? So I think that's the first thing I'll share. And the second thing is, of course, like so many other places on this planet, the South Asian subcontinent was colonized by many European countries, including particularly the British Empire. And my father's family ethnically is Punjabi. And the land of Punjab, the word Punjab means five rivers. And um, it is a land that has been divided through the violence of colonization since the British left the South Asian subcontinent and like gave the people their independence. And I'm putting that in quotes because one of their parting gifts was that a white man who had never set foot in the territory of Punjab literally looked at a map and just decided to draw a line. I'm sure there was more political context around it. I like to think of it as like a tool of colonial violence, why they decided to put the border between what's now India and Pakistan where they put it, but they divided the land of Punjab, which led to one of the largest um, forced migrations of human beings within a very short amount of time in modern history. And there was genocide on both sides of the newly created border based on communal violence, based on Hindus attacking Muslims and Muslims attacking Hindus, and a lot of people attacking Sikh and Parsi people. And so, inside of that context, my father's parents had to flee their ancestral homeland. So, on that side, we're actually pretty far into Punjab um, from a town called Chuck, which is near Rawalpindi. And then they moved to Lahore. But all of the places they were living before the British departed the South Asian subcontinent are like very distinctly on the side of the border that's now considered Pakistan.
Mm.
And so they fled to what's New Delhi. Uh, and my father was the first person in their family born after the migration. And so inside of all of that,
Yeah.
he was the youngest of four children, the four boys. He was, I think, the accident child because his three older brothers were 18, 15, and 11 years older than him. Um, and, I don't know enough of the details. I have my own theories and thoughts about why he was targeted in particular inside of his family and who exactly raped him when he was a child. But he ended up disclosing all of his own survivorship when the state of New Jersey, where I grew up, had finally caught up to our family.
Mm.
And so mandated reporting was triggered in my life. I'm the older child in my family, and I was no longer being targeted by my father through sexual violence. There were other kinds of violence in the house. But I had, I guess, aged out of his target population, and I have a younger sister. So, in my worry for her, in my care for her, I ended up disclosing to my mother, and my mother decided to call a therapist. And my mother, I must say for audience members, like also, people make all kinds of assumptions. So I like to give people as much information when I share my personal story as possible because because people make all kinds of biased assumptions. My mom grew up in the United States from the age of 11 onwards. Her mother was a professor and a socialist feminist activist, freedom fighter, had a master's degree in India, was a professor in India, got into a PhD program in the United States, left a cheating husband in India. My grandmother was an incredibly empowered woman, very iconoclastic, people might say, for her generation. But she didn't have any family members in the United States when she left India as a single mother. I believe she was 34 or 35 when she came here, and she had an 11-year-old and a 10-year-old, both daughters. And so, inside of that context, she was able to keep them housed and clothed and in a quote good school system. But what Cleveland, Ohio was, and Cleveland Heights specifically in 1969 was a very white and black community These were Indian little girls coming in with accents and a whole new racial identity. Um, Not that there weren't lots of South Asian people in the United States. Of course there were, but not that big of a population in Cleveland Heights in 1969. And inside of all of that, I think about my mother's loneliness inside of dealing with the concept of whiteness for the first time in her life. I think about her process of being racialized it for the first time in her life, inside of a white supremacist construction of race. And she got proselytized to in her loneliness and in her isolation by white children who were born again Christians, who were part of the Billy Graham tradition. And my grandmother, in her socialist feminism, believed in autonomy, and I also think was very busy. She was trying to get her PhD and she was working, and maybe wasn't in the weeds as much as she might have liked to be, and didn't quite catch what was happening to my mother in terms of this religious ideology taking hold at the young age of 14. And so it's in that context that she meets my father when she goes to college. College wasn't really her thing for a lot of different reasons, very rebellious against a lot of my grandmother's thinking and ideas, really wanted a traditional, whatever that means, you know. She wanted to do it right. Her parents hadn't had a marriage that lasted, and she really wanted to show that she could be a wife that kept it together, and thanks to the community of the church and all of that. My father had a history of pedophilia in his family through his survivorship that had already started in India against his nieces. And my mother was 18 and he was 26 when they first met. So already I might today note that under the larger umbrella of um, pedophile adjacent violence. I mean, I don't know. The law feels kind of arbitrary to me, like why an 18-year-old girl is okay to prey upon, but not a 17-year-old girl. You know, there was a huge power imbalance between them.
Yeah.
He had a history of violence. She already was a survivor. He already was a survivor. So inside of all of that, and a very insular, you know, they got married, they moved to New York City. I grew up in a working class community in Jackson Heights until my sister was born, and then they moved to like a blue collar suburb in New Jersey. My dad was a carpet salesman, but before that, they tried their hand at being shopkeepers, businesses that failed. And all of that feels relevant to me. You know, I know that this is meant to be your opening question, but it's really hard for listeners who really want to understand how does child sexual abuse happen and how do we end it?
Mhm.
For me, the answer to that question and in trying to entangle like what would have helped me as a child, the more I went down the path to study and to understand and to be in the praxis of healing with other survivors and organizing to end rape culture, the frame just got bigger and bigger and bigger because there really isn't an easy way today for me to describe what happened to me as an individual story of a family in a vacuum, because that's not how the systems that were triggered through mandated reporting responded to us. The system, when it did get triggered, my mother called a therapist to try to get help. The therapist was a white woman. My mother did not know what mandated reporting was.
Mm.
This is 1991 in northern New Jersey, before the Violence Against Women Act,
Mm.
which, you know, a problematic piece of legislation connected to the crime bill aside, it was the first federal legislation we had that set aside taxpayer money to try to train rape crisis center workers, domestic violence shelter workers in what the field calls cultural competence, right? So that had not happened yet
Yeah.
in 1991. And what a lot of people don't know about New Jersey is if you look at a map of the continental United States and you look at a map based on of all of the migrant populations, what is the country of origin of the that has the largest population in most of the continental United States because of geographic proximity? The answer is Mexico. But in New Jersey, the answer is actually India.
Mm.
I grew up in the largest Indian American population, one of the largest populations of the Indian diaspora on the planet, in the greater New York City region. And again, we were not wealthy. My parents were not doctors and engineers. And that matters in the context of what did white social workers
Mhm.
and white police officers and white prosecutors see when they stepped inside my home. And I don't mean what they saw with their eyes, I mean what they saw with their biases, to
Mhm.
be
Mhm.
clear. This was in a context in which hate crimes were happening from white teenage boys towards Indian men quite regularly in the early 90s in New Jersey. And I think it's very easy to want to label men of color broadly,
Mhm.
in my specific context, a working class Indian man, as something less than human, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and so inside of that, regardless of my own feelings about my father and what should have been done, there was no way for the dehumanization filter to be applied by the state to my father without it also being applied to my mother and my sister and myself.
Yeah.
And so what the state offered us, in quotes, um, the prosecutors told me at 13 that they could prosecute my mother for being complicit, in quotes, for the violence that had happened to me. And so what really has inspired my own personal approach to my work to end child sexual abuse is not only the direct experience of being raped by my father inside of a context of familial domestic violence, but also the deep understanding as a child that the state was also a source of violence.
Yes.
And then the last thing I'll share in my story around the state is that we did manage to get away from my father. It was not because of the state, but my mother's mother helped, her sister helped, some community members were helpful, her coworkers were helpful. Um, and when we finally were on the other side of being forced to live with him or see him, we did go back to the state and see if at the time I didn't know what abolition was. I wasn't an abolitionist at that time. I am today, but at 13, 14, 15, 16, I didn't have that language or lens of analysis. And so we tried to prosecute him with more information because I obviously had not gone forward with cooperating with the prosecutors when they said, well, we could prosecute your mom. I was like, okay, great. No, thank you,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know? And at 15 or 16, I think 16, we went back to see, like, okay, I'm ready to talk now. We're away from my father. And we couldn't because of double jeopardy, which is simply a law or a legal practice, rightfully, that says once someone is prosecuted for something, they can't be tried twice for the same crime.
Yeah.
Um, but what the state could give us at that time was forced therapy. So then we were forced my entire senior year of high school, me, my mother, and my sister, to go to state-led therapy sessions.
Mhm.
And that looked a lot of different ways. My mother had to go with a group of caretakers who were the quote non-offending parent to a circle just for non-offending parents. I had to go to a circle for teenage girls who were incest survivors who had had state intervention mandated reporting in their lives. Sometimes my mom and I would go together, or my mom and sister and I rarely would go. My sister was pretty young at that time. She was maybe by that time in the story, like 11 or 12. Um, it must be said that all of these therapists and social workers were white women. So huge gaps around cultural competence. In my group therapy with all of the other girls who had had state intervention, there was one other South Asian girl. She was Indo-Guyanese. She was the youngest. I was the one of two oldest, like seniors in high school. Everyone was in high school. I think the little one, maybe she was in eighth or ninth grade. Um, but her story was one of the stories that had stayed with me all these years. This was the first time in my life that I was hearing stories of other survivors, at 16, being like, oh, there's a lot of us, apparently, and seeing the mirroring that I talk about in my work today between myself and these girls, even though many things about our stories and identities were different.
Mhm.
But Pauline's story really made me understand that as truly horrific as most of my childhood was, it could have been actually even worse. Pauline was a ward of the state after being abused by her father and her brother after her mother passed away. And by the time she was 13, she had been put into foster care families with men who then further abused her. And so the state had put her with a lesbian couple. And this was 1994. So just to understand that a lot has changed, I think young people who might be listening maybe don't have this context. So again, the teacher in me is like, let me just make sure you understand
Yeah,
how bad it would have had to be for the state of New Jersey to put a child with a lesbian couple in New Jersey in
that's
1994.
right. Yeah.
Because that was not really a thing then. This was way pre-gay marriage.
A whole campaign against just
That's right.
queer adoption. It was not a thing. Yeah.
But Pauline got placed with this very nice lesbian couple who like helped her get into this state-led therapeutic program. And that's where we met in this group therapy circle. And what often happens for survivors the first time they have a modicum of safety, their nervous system finally relaxes, which actually does not feel good.
Mhm.
I think there's a misconception that healing is supposed to feel good, but I remember that moment that my nervous system finally relaxed, and it was pretty excruciating mentally because what you're starting to experience then is the way that the complex PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, shows up.
Mhm.
And inside of all of that, Pauline ended up getting institutionalized in the county mental health or psychiatric, really, hospital, where she was harmed by one of the staff members. She was one of two children to be harmed and written about in the papers that year, but she ended up taking her own life about a year after I met her. So again, I think there's just no way to talk about my own story without talking about still how young I was when this was happening to me and around me, and that it really informed just another layer of understanding like even these state-led hospitals are not places of healing for us.
Mhm.
And when I finally went to college, which was shortly after Pauline's death, a few months after Pauline's death, I was just so full of hope that I was moving on to a different part of my life where I would never have to think about these things again. Haha, joke was on me. And so angry, but didn't have the space or the words or the community to unpack any of my rage, my grief, my confusion, and just kind of barreled headlong into college. And that's a whole nother story. But because that's where my attempts at trying to unpack all of this and make sense of it and do something to end
Mhm.
child sexual abuse really began. But that's the origin of it. And thanks for
Mhm.
listening. It's always so long.
No, and this is, you're right. Even though it's a first question, that question is meant to go wherever it needs to go. And it always goes to a place of deep context. It's essential to have all of those pieces in here because I don't know what we're talking about otherwise, right? Like it's all connected and one thing informs another. I appreciate how you speak to the layers and how you speak to, you know, just the way that colonization, the way that harm, violence against from the state, harm on every single layer, harm from every single direction. Even folks who think, oh, this is the way to keep children safe, there is harm that is there, right? That threat that, oh, your mother, who's the non offending parent, is also going to be prosecuted as a threat. That is so harmful because I can't even imagine, right? If coming forth and being honest to protect your sister ends up in yet another form of violence, right? So I think it's important for people to hear all of this connected tissue because so often we don't connect the dots. So often we just look at it as in a silo and don't see the nuance and don't see also our own bias in listening in on the story that we need to be, I think, faced with the complexity of it. So thank you for sharing all of those pieces. Um, I think about the point of this season in Be the Bloom is really to kind of do that, to connect the dots for folks, to um, recognize that it is hard to sit with this as a topic overall. And it's really easier to look at child sexual violence over here and look at political violence over here and look at colonization over here and act as if they don't have anything to do with each other. And all of it comes together to allow this to continue. I think about the children in my life. I think about my own experience. I think about all the amazing people I get to chat with. And I'm like, we're still talking about an issue that still continues today. And so I wonder, like in your work, in your knowing, in your personal experience, how are we still dealing with this today? Why?
Well, you spoke to some of that yourself because it, I think, can feel overwhelming to really let yourself connect the dots.
Mm,
Something I have been articulating for a while, just in personal conversations, is that child sexual abuse is at the heart of empire. It is a symptom of imperialism and colonization and every other form of dehumanization, but it's also a tool of those things.
mm,
I could sit here and list any number of examples. And the thing is, I've been doing very public story sharing about my own lived experience and my analysis of it, and bringing in some of my professional experiences outside of abolitionist containers and how I understood like that doesn't work, that doesn't work, that doesn't work, right?
mm,
In addition to my own study around really wonderful abolitionist practices from some amazing teachers like Mimi Kim or Andrea Ritchie, or the list is very long, you know.
mm.
Um, but the thing is, those public storytelling experiences, which really started to ramp up on a bigger national stage for me in 2009, I can't think of a single year in which I gave keynotes or podcasts or presentations or testimonies in Congress in which there wasn't a fresh set of examples to use to illustrate what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It is the water that we're swimming in. And sometimes my co-director at Mirror Memoirs, Jaden Cervantes Fields, and I talk about Mirror Memoirs as the red food dye
Mm,
dropped into the water to try to help people see the water.
mm,
Because that is what we're talking about. It is, for example, um, we can talk about the different contexts in which it happens. I don't think child sexual abuse looks the same in every community. It is a contextual violence. That's why when I share my own story, I do talk about the Brahminical patriarchy in what's now a Hindu fascist government of India
mm.
and the Indian subcontinent, or the South Asian subcontinent more broadly. Um, you can't talk about ending child sexual abuse in that particular part of the world without talking about ending caste violence.
Yes.
But here in the US, where I was born, and where I still live, something that I have found useful to say to our organizational partners or our supporters or even our members to help them see the water
Mm,
is child sexual abuse was used as a tool to create what's now called the United States.
mm-hmm.
Black children were raped
Yep.
and Indigenous children were raped with not only the permission of the state, but the directive of the state
Mm-hmm.
on plantations, in missions, in boarding schools. And that violence continues today through, quote, immigrant detention centers,
Yep.
the project of reservations, the project of prisons. It has never stopped. It has simply changed containers. And so
Mm,
that's why in Mirror Memoirs, when we are really creating, we're a base building organization, we're a membership based organization. And we now describe, we're 10 years into our work, and today we describe our work as saying we're creating a community of belonging for anyone who wants to end child sexual abuse without leaving any survivors behind and without enacting violent state systems. And we start with offering a North Star question to everyone. Because if we really want to achieve that mission, don't leave people behind, don't create more violence in your interventions, then I think because of the context I was just offering and that you know very well from your own lived experience and your work, we have to start with the North Star question of what do Black and Indigenous gender nonconforming children
Mm-hmm.
living inside of the US and its territories need to be free from sexual violence. And at Mirror Memoirs, we add that layer of gender nonconforming children because when you study racial capitalism, there's no way to talk about what was done specifically to African people. And actually, yes, through the like colonization and genocide of indigenous peoples as well, without talking about European imperialists imposing gender binaries on both of those populations.
Yep.
That in order to create population control and ownership, people were divided into men on one side and women on one side. And actually, when you look at Afro-Indigenous traditions and
Mm-hmm.
indigenous to Turtle Island traditions, that was not indigenous. The gender binary was not indigenous
Yeah.
to people. It's also not indigenous to my own people.
Mm-hmm.
377, which is a section of the Indian Penal Code criminalizing sodomy, is a leftover from the Victorian British control.
Mm.
When you look at even our pre-colonial traditions and cultural traditions, because of the Code of Manu, there was already the subjugation of people with vaginas who got labeled girls at birth. But
Mm-hmm.
for people who were gender nonconforming but were assigned male at birth, that was fine. That, you know, there was a third gender identity in space. So I don't think this is a simple form of unpacking.
Yeah.
I don't think the answer as to why it continues is a simple answer because to really end all child sexual abuse, even just in a US context, one has to commit one's heart to the project of ending empire.
Mm. Mm.
And a lot of people aren't willing to do that yet.
Isn't that the thing? Right? Like the know, like, the knowing that to protect and save children from unnecessary harm in this world, right? The world is hard enough, right? But we know that, CSA is a precursor, is a setup for so many other hardships in life, mental health, emotional, financial, like all of the things connect. And so to know that empire is the priority over the life, the safety, the dignity, the care of another human being who like doesn't have the power to like then it blows my mind because I know that's entirely true. Like just the statement that child sexual violence is at the heart of empire is profound because it is true. And folks have to make choices. And in part it continues because folks are not making they're not making the choice to end it. What do we do with that? We continue to do what we're doing, right? And I think having this conversation hopefully be a catalyst for other folks to answer these questions that you're posing, to ask it to a friend, to ask it, to bring it up if you're working in an environment where you are, you know, children are in your care or you're working to advocate for children or just I don't know, anybody, like ask these questions. And it may be hard to be the person who does that. It may be like a little stressful, anxiety producing to bring this up in an environment where maybe this is never talked about. But I think you're offering different ways to start a conversation, and that's really important. Thank you for laying that out. I think so many people need to hear that. Um, I want to go to your work with Mirror Memoirs, which you've spoken about, you've touched on, right? But I think about the ways that like race, gender, sexuality, you know, all the pieces, right, of the intersection of identities work within the mission of Mirror Memoirs, within your both personal life, within the life of folks who are um, holding this work and moving it forward. And I wonder if there are ways in which you have experienced um, these dots that I'm speaking of be so disconnected, specifically at these intersections for folks within Mirror Memoirs, that other people need to consider and think of.
Can you ask the question in a different way so that my head can
Yeah,
wrap around it in a different way?
of course. So like we're talking about connecting all these dots, right? And I wonder if there is something specifically that you've noticed within your work in Mirror Memoirs, some dots that continue to be disconnected, whether with whoever, right? Um, that needs space, that needs to be highlighted.
It depends who I'm talking to.
Okay.
So I think there are people who come into the container of Mirror Memoirs. We have about 750 what we call core members. That's LGBTQI, Black, Indigenous, and of color child sexual abuse survivors
Mm,
across the US. Um, we have about 2,000 what we call accomplice members. And that's anyone else who's outside of the core member demographic, but is like, yeah, I vibe with the like quest towards this North Star question, and this mission to not leave survivors behind and to not enact violent systems. Um, and inside of that, there's so much diversity of where people are at when they first join the container,
mm, mhm,
right? Some people are coming in, they're like, I'm already an abolitionist feminist. I've never talked about my survivorship before. Some people are coming in and they're like, I literally run a rape crisis center, but they've never considered abolition before.
mm,
Some people are coming in because a loved one just disclosed being a survivor and they want to support that person.
mm.
Other people are coming in because they watch the news and child sexual abuse. I mean, yes, people might say, like, especially now, just for context for listeners, right? The like new batch of Epstein files, 3 million
Mhm.
pages or something, just dropped on Friday, and today is
Yep.
Tuesday. But honestly, like I said, there's always sensational news about child sexual abuse coming out because of how pervasive it is and how endemic one might say it is.
Mhm.
So sometimes people come into the container, they attend a panel discussion or a book club, or they see Transmutation, which is our filmed theater project, because they have kids in their lives
Mm,
and they are scared and they want some direction on what can I do? What can I do not just to keep my kids safe, but like I want to end this violence in the world.
mhm.
I think inside of that diversity, there are different sticking points for different people. But one sticking point sometimes for people is, um, and you hear this in the current news feed right now, today, uh, is the frame around violence against women and girls.
Mm,
It's not a frame I subscribe to personally,
mm,
because when you get into the data, um, that's in the field from very mainstream data sources like the Bureau of Justice Statistics or the American Academy of Pediatrics,
mhm.
one quickly learns that the rates are not really that different at baseline from, let's say, the Centers for Disease Control Adverse Childhood Experiences study
Mm.
for boys and girls. Let's just use cisgender frames for a moment because that's what
Okay.
most of the research does.
Yes.
So the initial baseline study around child sexual abuse and gender or sex is 1 in 6 boys and 1 in 4 girls. That's not that different as a baseline. And then there is a study that Mirror Memoirs specifically came out of or was motivated by, which was as I was ending grad school in 2011, the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Harvard School of Public Health collaborated to publish a study asserting that childhood gender nonconformity is a risk factor for child sexual abuse.
Mm. Okay.
In plain speak, if you look or act gender nonconforming, broadly speaking, we're not only talking about trans kids in this particular study,
Mm-hmm.
just you're signaling to adults around you
Mm.
just by being that you're doing gender differently than social norms. You're targeted. You are disproportionately at risk for being sexually assaulted as a child
Yeah.
because of transphobia, which I don't think I need in 2026. I should not need to educate anyone around how that's playing out
I'll
against
put a
children
link
across
so
this
folks can
country.
check it out if they
My
don't know. But
God,
you're right.
over
You're right.
500 bills, right? Literally targeting trans people. And
Yep.
many of those bills are child specific. Some of those bills are enacting things like genital checks or trying to fight for them to
Mhm.
protect cisgender girls from transgender girls in sports. I mean, I think this is a hard sticking point for people. A
Mhm.
lot of people who have the best intention to want to protect children get tripped up on their own transphobia.
Mm.
That doesn't mean it can't be unlearned.
Yeah.
I live in a family with a mother who's like a wonderful ally today. It's been a 30-year journey with that woman. I love her to death. Mom, if you're watching, love you. But it was a journey.
Yeah.
She at 14, no longer today, but at 14 was a very right-wing born again Christian. There was a lot of unlearning that had to happen. And I like to share that to say unlearning is a real thing.
Yeah.
I have very important people in my life, starting with my very beloved mother, who had to unlearn some things.
And she chose to.
She chose to, and she did the work.
Yeah.
I also obviously had to unlearn a lot of things. I was raised in this society too.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, we are raised, all of us, in rape culture.
Yes.
It doesn't matter actually whether you were a survivor or not. You were raised in rape culture. 100% of us were raised in rape culture. And part of rape culture is what Bell Hooks
Mm.
so articulately wrote about more than I can, around white supremacist, hetero-patriarchal, transphobic violence. It's part of rape culture. And so people get tripped up there a lot. They want to believe that this is a form of violence that happens more to cisgender girls than to anyone. And that's just actually not necessarily true.
Mhm.
Another thing that people really want to believe is that cisgender women don't rape children.
Which is not true.
That is definitely not true. The data says about 9% of child sexual abuse perpetration is done by women. And here's something when people balk, in case the balking is happening to the listeners, I just want to share something from my regular, degular, blue collar, middle class, public school, high school sociology class. Okay. I took a half credit class in like senior year of high school. And psychology class. I took 1/2 year of psychology and one of sociology. In the psychology half of the year, we learned about what at that time was called multiple personality disorder. Today it's called dissociative identity disorder.
Yeah.
You probably know this because you are a licensed professional. But for folks who don't know where the first DSM classification around dissociative identity disorder came from, it was from this girl named Sybil who
Mm.
had a fractured mind because of the type of repeated rape and other forms of abuse that happened to her over years by her mother.
Mhm.
So this disconnect is always very odd to me when it happens from licensed professionals
Mm.
who know the story of Sybil, because that is literally the origin in the DSM for dissociative identity disorder. Sybil, a young girl who was raped by her mother, and then people say child sexual abuse is done to girls by men, period. And that is
Mm,
just so untrue that we have high school curriculum about cases that are counterpoints to that statement.
yeah. Yeah.
And that there's a lot of other sticking points and missed connections for people, but that one is truly
Mm,
one of the most harmful to me
mm,
because we are seeing what that results in the policy world, in the philanthropy world.
mm,
People want to say we're working to end child sexual abuse, but people mostly are not. They're working to end sexual violence against cisgender girls, period.
mm.
And mostly they're working to end sexual violence against cisgender girls by cisgender men, period. And that leaves, I mean, for me, leaving even one person out is too many, but that leaves a lot of people out.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a good point. And I think that's such an important point because even if we look at first of all, we don't have the data that is fully accurate. Meaning, I always say if somebody's saying 1 in 4, it's really like 1 in 2, so we don't have accurate data. And the way that data is skewed to fit, well, a culture of violence or fit a certain narrative, um, makes it so much more likely we are to believe it and we are to buy into it. And that's harmful. And so I appreciate you connecting those dots and how we're talking about it, how we're teaching about it, how we're um, uh, even thinking about it. Because if we are framing it in this limited way, we leave a whole lot of people out, but also then that leads to um, not really resourcing, not really supporting, not really thinking about what the needs are of everybody who's experiencing sexual violence. So it's easier to put it aside when it only relates to you or it only relates to. I think that's such an important point to think about programmatically, conversationally, intervention wise, however folks are defining intervention, but like, how do we broaden this scope? Um, Thank you. I mean, this kind of connects to the next question, which I feel like you've answered already, which is, what needs to change in order for children to be truly protected? What would a world free of child sexual violence even look like? Um, if anything in that speaks to you, if you have a vision of what that world will look like, I would love to see that world. I would be so happy to see that type of world. But like, what is the vision of what that could even feel like or be like?
You know, I got to travel across the United States from 2016 to 2018, just interviewing one-on-one LGBTQI BIPOC child sexual abuse survivors.
Mm,
I didn't have much of a budget, so I didn't get to all 50 states, but I pieced together speaking engagements and consulting gigs and whatnot, and I got to talk to 60 different people
mm,
across 16 different states. And I asked all of them the same, more or less the same 15 questions. I definitely ask everybody the following question. If you went through a portal right now into another dimension in which capitalism does not exist, and your only responsibility while you're there, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, is to heal yourself,
mm,
and you have a bottomless toolbox with every spiritual, material resource that you could need to support your healing, what's in the box? And that archive, at least 25 stories from that archive is coming out this September. So I want to leave a placeholder there for people. I'll share some of my ideas, but I can offer just my ideas. And I think the reason I love that question and having had the privilege of witnessing so many answers to that question is it's going to look different for everyone.
mm,
I think at the end of the day, it's about people getting their needs met and not just their survival needs, but like their pleasure and connection needs, you
mm.
know? Um, Nobody in the archive said prisons and police, by the way.
Whoa.
I mean, but
Yeah,
this is what we're offered as survivors.
very true.
We
Very
survive
true.
all this violence, and then society goes, Here's some police and some
Mm,
prisons for you. Here's a court system,
yeah.
and that's not what people asked for. They wanted body work, um, like somatic healing, myofascial release, acupuncture, They wanted really good food and food um, security.
Yeah.
So, like continued access to really healthy, good food. A
Mm,
lot of people named emotional support animals, art supplies, musical instruments, housing security, a beautiful home, one might even
mhm,
say. Some people were said, like, I want a tiny home around all of my loved ones' tiny homes on beautiful land that we can't get kicked off of, you
LGBT.
know?
Yes.
Um, with like interdependent communities of care, you know. In my
Mhm,
own answer to the question, I'm not a full-time parent, but I have a little brother who's 28 years younger than me. And that's such a big age difference that I have been part of a parenting team of
mm,
him with my mom and stepdad and my sister, who I grew up with. And I had to kind of sit with okay, this violence all around us is not ending, and I really want to keep this child safe and
mm,
happy and resourced. So, what are the small micro movements I can do to
mm,
change the culture of my family? We had gotten my biological father out, right? My stepfather is
mhm,
this child's father, and that in and of itself changed the family dynamic. But also, there were other conversations that needed to be had. So, the rest of my family was not necessarily coming at this parenting work or task as abolitionist queer feminists like
mm,
I was.
mhm,
And so even sometimes if I was the only person modeling something for my brother, it still felt like an important intervention. So let me
mhm,
give a concrete example. I'm pretty sure I'm the only person. He's now 19. He's a college freshman. But, when he was little, I think I'm the only person who asked him questions like, what pronouns do you think you use?
mm,
What do you think your identity is? And he knew trans people from infancy because of me. I'm
mhm,
in so much community with so many amazing people who happen to be transgender. So that wasn't different for him to know about. But he had the space and, even offering him different types of clothes, different types
mhm,
of toys, um, and letting him pick, truly, like, you want to wear the green sequin shoes one day and play with the dolls or have the home kitchen, or do you
mhm,
like sports? And all of that is fine, and I think sometimes people who are struggling with homophobia and transphobia um, have a lot of misunderstanding or assumptions that the desire for queer and non-binary, I'm non-binary, or, trans parents is that we want our children to be just like us. But
mm,
that was never my agenda. I wanted my brother to be his best self,
yeah.
and it turns
Mm,
out that he is a cisgender straight young man, you know. It doesn't work like an inheritance, A child is who they are, and the work of parenting is to let them be who they are with love and care and support and protection and development intellectually and emotionally. And I think sometimes that means really unlearning things that feel uncomfortable to unlearn in a normative society of rape culture. For
mm,
example, really interrogating, like, are you going to gender that fetus? Are you going to gender that newborn?
mhm,
Are you going
mm,
to assign pronouns before a child can tell you who they are?
mm,
Um, are you going to only shop on one side of the clothing section?
mm,
Are you going to gender the toys? Like, what could it really look like to actually give a young spirit who arrives to this world space to just unfurl into who they are and let them show us who they are, you know?
mm.
And that's my personal vision. It's very hard to achieve in such a violent society that is constantly trying to interrogate, particularly like queer and trans parents of color. So
Mhm.
I'm not judging anyone who's not able to give their child that space. But since you asked about my
Mm,
highest vision, like that's it. It's like,
mm,
wow, how amazing that there's a new life here. How do we just give this being room to unfurl
mm,
around us and to know that no matter what aspect of their authentic being, they show
mm,
us as the adults around them that they are 100% loved and protected, you
mhm.
know?
Yeah, I love that vision. I would love to see a whole world of those children. And we get to tend to the children in our lives now as much as we can in that way, right? And with this in mind, how do we build that kind of world in the here and now?
Mhm.
Um, I wonder where you get your hope from, where you get your encouragement from, um, and any encouragement that you feel you'd like to share with other survivors listening.
You know, I was a youth organizer for 12 years from the age of 22 to 34. And what was so that was the time period in my life that and like 17, I would say 17 to like my early 30s was the time period in my life that my experience of living with complex PTSD was most acute, which
Mm,
meant that my depression was most acute and um didn't have a practice or really a steadiness around hope or healing or any of that at that time, just kind of fumbling my way through it. But working directly with people one-on-one and in small groups allowed me to see on a daily basis all the ways we were changing each other
mm,
and all the things we could create together,
mm,
you know? And they weren't necessarily undoing these larger systems around us. It was painting a mural in this cafeteria of a very over-policed and criminalized and under-resourced public high school in Giuliani and Bloomberg's New York City.
mhm.
In Brooklyn, where class, the school was almost 100% Black, Canarsie High School.
Mercy. Yep.
And, just helping those young people who came to the after school program that I helped run have a place where they could unfurl
Mhm.
and they could learn language to put to their lived experience and wisdom and have I wasn't that much of an adult, but a slightly older adult support their efforts to try to make change, even if it was just going classroom to classroom in a peer education campaign during the George W. Bush presidency around abstinence-only education and doing comprehensive peer-to-peer sex education,
Yeah.
right? So I think as big and as far as I can go in my own analysis of how to understand why child sexual abuse continues, I think it's really important to share with people that I anchor myself through um, micro level interventions that are relational
Mm,
because that is what keeps me anchored. My love with other people and love in the broadest sense, not
mm,
just romantic love, but like a camaraderie where we are committed
mm,
to, I now call it this North Star vision, a world in which Black and Indigenous gender nonconforming children can be free. Okay, cool. How do we create that together today? You
mm,
know, this weekend, it looked like my friends and I, who are all doing amazing things in the world, like, checking in on each other because we're all childhood rape survivors who
mm,
are queer and trans people of color, saying, "You good?" No, no, I'm not. But okay, did you eat? Can
mm,
I send you a meal? Did you go take a walk? Do you want to take a walk together?
mm,
Um, do you want to make some art? I got a candle making kit recently to like refill all my empty pillar candles, and a friend who is these identities as well came over and we melted some wax and talked and, poured the candles together. I mean, sometimes it's as simple as that. Um, because it is building relationships and building community from that seed, right? That the layers of relationality and trust and care sort of ripple out if we continue to be weavers. It's thinking beyond the nuclear family. It's thinking beyond even just personal friendships to like really build community-wide structures that can
Yeah.
hold this level of like collective care, you
Hmm.
know. I'm a board member of something called the Fire Poppy Project, which stemmed out of the Eaton fires. And in like the Pasadena area, San Gabriel Valley of Los Angeles County. And a year in, there's a whole organization um, organizing people whose homes were either burned down or contaminated by carcinogenic ash to not only get the homes that are left standing remediated properly, but to make sure people are fed, to make sure people are fighting ice raids together, to make sure that people are patrolling their neighborhoods and keeping each other safe, checking on each other. Like it's that those kind of friendships and political projects, like the small all the way into the bigger, um, keep me grounded in these times. I don't know so much
Yeah.
about hope, but I feel determined, I
Yeah.
feel clear and grateful that at such a tiny age, I had a vision that something better was possible than what I was experiencing. And then I was lucky that the
Mm.
small steps I took to use my voice were heard. And, with a lot of danger around, it was very hard
Mhm.
and very dangerous for my mother and my sister and I to leave my father, as it
Mhm.
is when one is leaving an abuser.
Yep.
Um, but I know that it's possible because I lived it. And so when I think about the abuser that is the state, I know
Mhm.
that it's possible for us to leave this abuse.
Mhm.
And it's going to be dangerous, but we have like a huge, huge, extensive network of lived wisdom and experience about how to leave abuse collectively.
Yeah.
Many of us have gotten out of abusive situations before, and if we can figure out how to stay in this together because we are all being abused by the same state, by the same system, it's going to be a collective effort, but I know that it's possible,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
I mean, to me, that I would imagine that will connect with someone as hopeful, right? Like that they're not alone with what they're sitting with, or even the language you're offering folks around possibilities um, of what they're experiencing. Probably, oftentimes, sitting alone with that reality, you know? You've mentioned a few times like the people who were supposed to be offering care, offering resources, offering support, and the harm, right? The state harm, individual harm that folks were doing. What's one thing that you want people in that role as care providers, um, across the spectrum of what that looks like, to know? Like, what's one skill you even want them to have?
Hmm. I think that in 2026,
Mm.
licensed providers, broadly speaking,
Mhm.
right? Because there's so many kinds of licensures, teachers, doctors, nurses, social workers,
Mhm.
therapists. If you're licensed by the state towards some kind of healing, helping, care profession, there are more resources in 2026 to help you navigate how to not lose your license and not be a henchman of the state than have ever existed before.
Mm.
I will point people to the work of people like Mimi Kim, Shannon Perez Darby. Mimi created Creative Interventions and wrote a whole toolkit and book, which is documenting the stories of hundreds of groups or individuals who intervened in cases of intimate violence without relying on police.
Mm.
And she's a professor of social work at Cal State Long Beach now. So very well documented work and helped one of the many people who helped create what today is called the practice of abolitionist social work.
Mm.
Um, Shannon Perez Darby is an organizer in the Seattle area whose current body of work is specifically around how to not engage in the violence of mandated reporting as a licensed provider and
Mm,
still help people and still provide, care that is meaningful and that matters, and how to walk that line in the gray
yeah.
areas, because this was always contested. And during a time of um, broadening fascism, I'm very aware that fascism has always existed for Black and Indigenous people in the United States. Currently, we're all under a fascist regime. And
Mm,
so I think that the tension for licensed providers is uh, only more difficult now. And just know that if that's the position you're in as a licensed provider, there are more resources than we had 30 years ago written down, thanks to scholar activists like the folks that I've named. And I'm sure there are many others that, folks can check out, like look up abolition and social work, look up abolition mandated reporting. I mean, there's a lot that's been written and created to the point of just workshops and trainings and,
mm,
ways to be thoughtful. So that is something that I'm pretty clear is not going to be widely adopted in graduate school curricula for obvious reasons. So people need to do their independent homework. It's not enough to just go through your core curriculum and get your license. If
mm,
you really want to practice the um, ethos of do no harm, then you have to do your work to understand what the state really is and always has been, and how do you um, really help people despite the violence of the state,
yeah.
instead of enabling the violence of the state and becoming its henchman is the word that keeps coming to mind.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a complex place, right? And thinking about how do you do it? How do you know the harm and how do you work around it? But also, how do you disrupt the harm and have that not keep you from continuing to offer care, right? Because of whatever the fear of real fear of being not able to actually continue to offer that support. Many folks ask me, what are alternatives to reporting, right? What are community interventions to reporting? This is an area I want to talk more about because on its face, there are some, but mm, I think it's about the application and it's about the knowing how to utilize them without the other fear from the state of if something happens again, that child can be taken away, right? So I think of this as like everybody has to be on board, everybody has to be invested in protecting these children in order for certain things to work. So I think this is a great topic to explore more on how to really encourage folks to have alternatives outside of what is presented, right?
Yeah,
Thank you
two
for
two
sharing that.
other sure, two other
Yeah.
great resources if folks are not aware of them. The work of the organization Interrupting Criminalization that was co-founded and is co-led by Andrea Ritchie and Miriam Kaba, two Black abolitionist feminists, and the work of Movement for Family Power. They are a national organization. One of their co-directors lives here. And another Black feminist abolitionist organization. Their work is specifically around ending the violence of family policing,
Mm,
and still keeping children safe, to your point. So,
yes.
you know, that's not exactly where my own production of research and knowledge has been. It's like we're in relationship with these other bodies of work as mirror memoirs, and so
Yeah.
really would love for people to check out all of their work.
That is great. That's amazing. Thank you. I mean, this goes to that question that I have about resource, books, articles, etc. We're going to include all these resources that you've provided in links so that folks can check them out and really explore them. Is there anything that maybe I haven't asked you that you feel needs space or is important to share as we close out?
One more resource before I forget it.
Yes, please do.
My dear friend, actually, who introduced us, Aisha Shahida Simmons, and her anthology, Love with Accountability, It is another offering around, if not prisons, police, child welfare courts, then what? It is a collection of, I believe, 38 Black child sexual abuse survivors who all agree that abolition is the only way to keep children safe, and particularly Black children. And it is an incredible read that I would
Mm,
point people to as well.
awesome. Yes,
Um,
she did
anything
introduce me.
else? Yes, she did. I'm so grateful that she did.
Mhm.
Anything else that you didn't ask me? Gosh, that's a hard question.
I
You don't know
mean,
what you
I
don't
didn't ask
know.
you a lot, I'm sure, but like anything that feels relevant that you think people should know.
Hmm. I think that the thing I am always navigating in my own life, and I know that I'm not the only one, is just the economic cost of being a childhood rape survivor.
Hmm.
There have been studies done on this, and I always have questions of like, who are you using for your data sources? Because, it's over $100,000 per person, per survivor to have just survived the long-term health effects. I don't think that those studies are done on people living at the intersections of oppression.
Hmm.
Um, I think that the body of work that would be produced around the cost, and I'm not just saying economically, but just also like in your humanity, also through the lens of disability and trauma-related disabilities, is exponentially higher when you live at the intersections of identities that are criminalized by the state.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the literature around survivorship and trauma is written with white cisgender women in mind
Hmm.
as the victim or survivor. And the picture looks incredibly different when, just with my own or your own lived experience, you survive all of this stuff in your home in childhood inside of the container of all of the or network nexus of this state violence. But then when you grow up, even if you can change your home life, as we've both been lucky enough to do, you're now facing life as an adult of navigating state systems that may be directly targeting you. My
Hmm.
partner is a transgender man who's Black. He's also a professional athlete. He is so directly targeted by this current fascist regime. Um, there's no way to talk about some of the stress related disabilities and chronic illnesses that I live with without that adulthood context of new trauma and new violence. So, like, yes, I am more susceptible to certain things because of the way my adrenal system,
Hmm.
my central nervous system, my immune system was so compromised from having been raped over 430 times across 8 years of my childhood.
Hmm.
And most of the literature around understanding, quote, post-traumatic stress disorder is not written to understand a population of childhood violence survivors who grow up to continue surviving fresh and new trauma
All at the same time.
all at the same time. And then we have to find the money for the copays that are not
Hmm.
covered for various trauma-related surgeries or therapies or body works to try to stay alive as long as
Yeah,
we can.
that's true.
And, you know, when I think about the importance of abolition, for me, it is twofold. It is, yes, to stop doing more violence.
Mm.
Well, I guess it's threefold. It's to stop doing more violence. It's to not fund things that are a waste of time and money because the systems themselves like just perpetuate violence. But it also, if we just stopped funding prisons, police, and the military, do you know how much taxpayer money that is? I mean, we
Yeah.
could have everything that we are dreaming of in that portal and more. Everyone
Oh
could
my
have
goodness.
housing. Everyone could have universal health care. Everyone could have free education, including through college. Everyone could have, money, reparative money set aside by the state for free acupuncture, which by the way is scientifically proven to help shrink trauma-related tumors. So I'm not
Mm.
just saying acupuncture because it's fun,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Then the needles,
right,
Yeah.
herbal treatments,
Yes.
guaranteed income, good fresh food. the things that are actually healing to people, we could have all that and more. And it's not pie in the sky. We spend so much of our money on prisons, police, and the military.
And so many other things lately that don't need to be done.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%. We could have the world that maybe a good chunk of us envision, that is that allows everyone to really live the liberated life, um, free of violence, free of, fear, fear of, I think about that book, Weathering, fear of like just everything that sits on top of one trauma, as it sits on top of another, as it sits on top of another, like all of these come together. And it's really hard to heal as more traumas are coming at you every single day. It makes it incredibly difficult. So I'm with you on that vision and the economic cost. And if we could turn our attention to making that a reality.
And to make sure that people who are trying to help, the large majority of licensed helpers, if we want to use that framing for a moment, are white people.
Mhm.
And, we have a lot of wonderful white accomplices who are really committed to practicing anti-racism in Mirror Memoirs.
Mm,
And the call to action for the white helpers who are licensed by the state is to make sure that you always remember the frames that one is taught in graduate school around trauma and healing are not applicable to people continuing to be targeted by systems of state violence.
yeah.
What is post-traumatic
Mm,
for me or you? I would love for someone to try to explain that to me, you
yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And so the best thing people can do is, when our organizations offer places to learn generously from all of our acquired lived wisdom and experience, pay for the trainings,
Mm,
you know, um, come to the programs, read the many books. My God, how many brilliant books have been offered
mm,
so generously by people with the lived experience of interpersonal violence and state violence. And be humble enough to realize that in order to really help people unfurl inside of this layered trauma of individual and state violence, like mostly you have to support people with resources and just let them know that you're there to walk beside them, but that you
mm.
definitely don't have the answers just because you have a license from the state.
That's right. That's right. You're not an expert of anyone but yourself. We all are of ourselves. Yeah. That humility is so key. Uh, Thank you for sharing all your wisdom and all the things and all, like I was like, okay, I took a note and then I took another note and then I took another note. Because this is um this is so obviously close to my heart and so close to the conversations that I want more folks to be having. I know folks are having it, but I want more folks to be having it because this is everybody's issue. And I always think about this as a table. And if we're going to make this dent, we all have to take a seat at the table and we all have to do it together. So thank you for, all the work that you do and for really giving folks a lot to think about and talk about, and to consider as they hopefully take on the charge of really taking their own seat and making a dent in this issue. So,
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the work that
of
you're
course,
doing. I'm so excited for all that you're building with Cactus and Bloom and for this podcast. I'm really honored to have gotten this invitation. So really, it's always fun to talk to you. It was fun to do it with other people tuning in.
I know. Well, we will go back to just talking the two of us, but
Yeah, absolutely.
thank you. And we'll see what blooms.
Thanks, Ebony.
was a lot shared today, and I want to encourage folks listening to connect with what resonated with you most. Consider one practice you can take from here and move into learning more about or even practicing if it feels appropriate to do so. If you would like to support the work of Cactus in Bloom to bring you these type of conversations and to do culture change work that builds skills, creates awareness, and improves equitable care for survivors of childhood sexual abuse and sexual violence in adulthood, consider a donation. Your contribution can make a world of difference. And together, let's see what blooms.